Trying to wrap your head around what the Russian public really thinks about the war in
Mhm.
Ukraine,
Yeah.
it's a puzzle.
It really is. You get the sense that there's so much we in the West don't know. So many factors we aren't considering.
It can feel like, honestly, like we're missing some pieces.
I'd agree with that.
But there's this report, The Reluctant Consensus,
Hmm.
by Maria Snegovaya.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one for the Atlantic Council, right?
Right. And it sheds some light, I think, on what's going on inside Russia. How Russians are actually viewing this whole situation.
Well, that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Exactly. What do Russians think about the war? Why do they think it? And what does it all mean for them and for us?
Some really big questions, really.
Huge. And one of the things that really struck me in the report was, like, this paradox. Why is there so much support for the Kremlin?
Yeah.
Even with all the sanctions, the economic hardship, the isolation.
It doesn't seem to make sense on the surface, does it?
It really doesn't. It feels like, logically, people would be turning against the government, not rallying behind it.
Well, human behavior isn't always logical, especially when you have things like, well, what Snegovaya calls the rally around the flag effect.
Right. That's that surge in, like, national unity and support for leaders that you often see during conflicts.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. A really interesting phenomenon. We've seen it throughout history, and it's playing out in Russia right now.
And she argues that this rallying around the flag effect, doesn't just fade away.
Right.
It has a lasting impact, bolstering patriotism and people's trust in the state, even when things are tough.
It's almost like it creates this feedback loop. The more people rally, the more they're exposed to the government's narrative.
Which reinforces their beliefs and strengthens their support even further.
Exactly. So it's not just a temporary blip. It has these really significant long-term consequences.
Fascinating. And Snegovaya doesn't just stop there. She breaks down Russian society into these distinct groups, based on their views on the war.
Right, showing that it's not this monolithic block of support that, we sometimes imagine in the West.
Exactly. Like she talks about the loyalists. They're the largest group, almost half the population.
They're the ones who are largely pragmatic in their support. They might not necessarily be, gung-ho about the war, but they see aligning with the Kremlin as the best course of action.
Maybe out of fear, maybe because they genuinely believe in what the government is doing.
Could be a bit of both. And then you have the hawks, the folks who are ideologically committed to the war.
Right. Snegovaya found they're more common in rural areas, which makes sense, right? Where they're more reliant on state-controlled media.
Makes sense. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the opponents. They tend to be younger, more urban.
And they're getting their information from independent sources like online media.
Exactly. They're the ones voicing dissent. But, as Snegovaya points out, they're fragmented.
And they lack the influence to really challenge the Kremlin.
It's a real David and Goliath situation, in a way.
And this is where the control of information comes in. It's so central to understanding all of this. Snegovaya really emphasizes the power of state-controlled TV.
Oh, absolutely. It's the primary source of news for a lot of Russians, and it paints a very specific picture of the war in the West.
A very carefully constructed narrative, for sure.
Definitely. But then you have these alternative sources like YouTube, Telegram, things like that.
And those are providing, like, a counter-narrative, a different perspective.
Right. But the key is who's accessing those sources.
And how much trust do they place in them?
Right. Because what Snegovaya found is that a lot of Russians actually avoid information that contradicts the official line.
It's almost like they're deliberately shielding themselves.
Well, yeah. Think of it this way. You've got this deeply ingrained love for your country.
Right.
And you're suddenly facing economic hardship, sanctions, uncertainty. To reconcile those two things, it's easier to embrace the narrative that the West is to blame.
So you're saying it's a way of managing cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. That mental discomfort you feel when you're holding conflicting beliefs, it's easier to just, block out the stuff that doesn't fit.
To preserve that sense of internal consistency.
Precisely. And what's really remarkable is how quickly a lot of Russians have adapted to the economic fallout of the war.
You're talking about the sanctions, the disruptions?
All of it. I mean, there was that initial shock, of course.
Yeah.
But then people adjusted their spending, found alternative sources for goods, and crucially, they kind of internalized the government's narrative about the economy.
So it's like they've normalized the situation.
In a way, yeah. Which makes it even harder for the opposition to gain traction. Now, of course, there's always the question of how reliable polling data is in an authoritarian regime.
Right. Can people really speak freely?
It's a legitimate concern, but Snegovaya makes a pretty strong case that while there might be some preference falsification, people telling pollsters what they think they want to hear, the overall trend is clear. A significant portion of the Russian population either supports the war or at least acquiesces to it.
So, taking all of this into account, Snegovaya's report really highlights the power of decades of state-led messaging, building that deep distrust of the West, fostering that us versus them
Yeah,
mentality.
that's the foundation. And on top of that, you have a relatively resilient economy, despite the sanctions, and a very effective propaganda machine.
Which all work together to create this environment where support for the war, or at least tolerance of it, can flourish.
It's a complex, multi-layered situation, for sure. And what's really interesting is that Snegovaya's report is really good at explaining the why. Why Russians think the way they do.
Right.
But the big question, the one that we're all grappling with, is what happens next?
Yeah, where does this all go from here?
Exactly. How will public opinion evolve as the war grinds on? And what impact will that have on Russia's relationships with the rest of the world?
Questions we don't have the answers to yet, but we definitely need to keep asking them. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I hope you found it illuminating. And as always, keep those questions coming, folks. We're all in this together, trying to make sense of a world that's constantly shifting. Until next time, stay curious
Definitely.
and keep learning.
Always.